Whenever I'm sitting on that side and across the pew to turn the thing on, I'm always waiting to see if Byron's going to flinch. Like, oh, is he about to call me out for something? It is good to see everyone this evening. Glad that we can be here and worship and stay together. If you remember, we have been looking in a little more depth at some of the characters that are given to us in Hebrews chapter 11 and trying to kind of get a sense for, depending on the character, either why they are such a good example of faith or sometimes why they're an example of faith at all. Some of them don't really seem like they should be there just at first glance. And so I want us to be able to kind of deep dive a little bit into some of these things in a way that we didn't do just kind of with the more overview type way that we looked at Hebrews 11 going through the class. So tonight, we're going to talk about Gideon. Once again, we're going to tell the story of Gideon, but I hope as we do this, we'll be emphasizing specific things that help us both see why it's kind of confusing that he's here, but also why he's here nonetheless as we move through. If you are familiar with the book of Judges at all, you know that there is a cycle going on, and it is not a pretty cycle. Israel has entered the promised land under Joshua, and very quickly after Joshua and his contemporaries pass away, Israel begins to abandon God, to slack off on their duty to take over Canaan and to drive out the pagans. And ultimately, we see a cycle beginning of rebellion, which is followed by oppression, which is followed by deliverance, which is followed by more rebellion, over and over and over. These judges who take over, they're called judges because they would kind of be the, how shall we put this, kind of a civil authority in the system that Israel had in place, but they aren't judges in the sense that we think of. You know, we have separate branches, right? Executive, and legislative, judicial. Well, we think of judges as being part of the judicial branch. Well, really, a judge in their day was kind of a little bit of all of the above. Maybe not so much the legislative in their case, because they already had a law, but they were kind of the ones who took charge in war, but also who kind of managed things in peace as well as a leader. So in this particular setting, as we begin in Judges 6, we see once again the cycle is continuing. Midian has taken over in this case. Midian and some of their allies, they are oppressing Israel. They have been oppressing Israel for years by the time the story begins. And there is a young man who is threshing wheat in a wine press. Now, if you know anything at all about wine presses, you probably know they're not made for threshing wheat. They're made for grapes. However, Gideon, this young man who is the youngest in his father's house and not really a prominent family in his tribe, he has the menial task of threshing wheat in a wine press in order to try and hide it from the Midianites. Because see how the Midianites in particular would operate for their conquest of Canaan, or their conquest of Israel rather, is that they would essentially let Israel kind of do their thing until harvest. And then as soon as Israel tried to harvest, they would swoop in and steal as much as they could, and that's how they profited from the arrangement. So he is trying to thresh wheat, he's trying to hide all this from the Midianites, quite frankly, so his family can eat. And an angel of the Lord appears to him. Now, we've talked several different times about this concept, this figure, rather, of the angel of the Lord, so we won't go into all the detail. Most likely, I would say the evidence would indicate he is probably a divine figure rather than an angel as we think of angels. This is probably an appearance of God in a form to Jesus, or to Gideon, rather. And so, this angel of the Lord appears to Gideon, and he greets him with a proclamation. He says, "Blessed are you, mighty man of valor." And you can just imagine pitiful young Gideon hiding in a wine press with a little bit of grain to try and save for his family. Oh yeah, I'm a mighty man of valor right here. Look at me. Here we go. Yeah, right. No, what are you talking about? I am the last thing that comes to mind when we think of a man of valor. Nevertheless, the angel of the Lord tells him, he says, "I'm going to deliver Israel through you from the oppression that they are enduring." Gideon says, "How am I supposed to know this? God has abandoned us. Clearly, when you look at what our forefathers told us happened to them, well, that's not happening now. So obviously, he's abandoned us. Notice, Gideon doesn't say God never, did all that in the first place. He doesn't deny God's existence or God's ability to save. He says God has abandoned us. In a sense, he's kind of right, isn't he? Not maybe in the way that Gideon is saying, but God has removed himself because of Israel's sin. Nevertheless, the angel of the Lord says, no, I am going to save Israel through you. And so Gideon asks for a sign. If it is truly you, if what you're saying is really true, show me a sign. Wait here until I get back. The angel says, I'll wait. And so Gideon goes and gets some food that would essentially be considered kind of an offering. He gets this food and he sets it on a rock before the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord is carrying a staff. And so as he sets all this food up, long story short, the angel of the Lord touches the tip of his staff to the food, and it is consumed in a fire. And he disappears in the fire as well. And Gideon says, oh boy. He says, I've just seen the angel of the Lord. My life is now forfeit. Human beings aren't supposed to see such things. But God tells him, no. The indication is, I showed you this because I want you to do a job, not so I could kill you. What would be the point of that? But he tells Gideon, here's my first job for you. He says, there's an idol in your hometown. There is a place set up to worship the Baal and the Asherah. I want you to tear it down and burn it. Well, Gideon has already, I always forget to move the slides through. Gideon has already gone through this process of establishing this was the angel of the Lord who said this to me. And so this fire that is conjured from the staff, well, okay, this is an indication of something. So he says, well, I need to do this. But he's afraid, nonetheless. Now, we might just think it's wise how he does it, but he does it, we're told, because he's afraid. He takes some of the men of his father's house, the servants, and they go at night. Why would you attack someone's sacred place during the daytime when they can see you? No, you attack at night. So he attacks at night. And I say attacks, there's no one there. But he attacks the idol statue, the altar, the high place that is set up, chops it down, burns it. Well, people naturally, as all this happens, they are up in arms the next day. They say, who has done this? Who has taken down the idol? Who has profaned Baal in this way? And however they find out, I don't think we're really told unless I missed something going through the text. But however they find out, someone says, it has to be Gideon. So much for going at night, right? And they say, well, he deserves to die for that. His father, ironically, says, perhaps trying to save his son, we can imagine, if Baal's really as powerful as we all think he is, can't he defend himself? Why should we take matters into our own hands? Baal will defend himself. Which is why Gideon is also named, and if you go through Judges, you might see this name sometimes, he's also named Drum Bell. Baal being part of that name, it's essentially a reference to this incident. Will not Baal defend? Time goes on. Not much time, but a little bit. And Gideon is spurred on by this call of the angel of the Lord to summon Israel to his banner, to throw off the oppression of the Midianites. He blows the trumpet, we're told, which is a sign everyone's supposed to gather together. We might think in kind of modern history of our own beginnings as a country, when you would have the Minutemen who were kind of on short notice, ready to stand up and fight, right? Kind of a similar dynamic here. This is the, all right, we've been wanting to throw off our oppressors for a while. This is the signal. Let's all rally to this guy who's willing to stand up and lead us in throwing off Midian. He blows the trumpet. People begin to assemble to Gideon. But Gideon's still afraid. Once again, he wants reassurance from God. And so now he asks him for a different sign. He already got fire burning up food. You'd think that would be enough. But he says, I'll tell you what, God, I'm going to put some fleece out in the middle of the pasture overnight. And I always get them mixed up. But the first time, he says, well, one of the times he says, I want there to be dew on the fleece, but not on the ground. Next time, he says, I want there to be dew on the ground, but not on the fleece. Each time he makes this request, he gets up the next morning. The first time, as he requested, he squeezes water out. It's just flowing out of the fleece, but there's no dew on the ground. The second time, there's dew all over the ground. You can imagine wearing sandals. His feet are sopping wet by the time he gets to the fleece, picks it up, and dries his feet off because it's dry. We have signs once again for Gideon. And he says, all right, I'll go to war. I will fight to deliver God's people. But this is when we have God test Gideon even more. At this point, we have about 32,000 men who have come to fight with Gideon. Now, 32,000 men in the ancient world, that's a pretty good-sized army. Many of them are not trained professional soldiers, so, give and take, right, from a human perspective, but that's a good chunk of people. God says, you got too many men. Now, what general in their right mind would say, I have too many people. I need less. But nonetheless, God says you have too many men. So first of all, ironically, Gideon says, anyone who's afraid, you can go home. Now, the irony of that is, guess who we have seen throughout this entire story so far is afraid? Gideon. But he says, anyone who's afraid, go home. Over 2/3 of the army goes home. Now, you want to talk about, we don't often talk about this part of the story, but you want to talk about a blow to morale for your army. Whoever's afraid, go home. I mean, you've seen those speeches, right? In like the battle movies and stuff like that, where they're about to make their last stand. If anyone wants to leave, leave now. You seen the old Alamo, was it with John Wayne and whoever else? And it's like, hey, here's the line. You're going to stay, you're going to go. And everyone stays, and they fight to the death. Yeah, that's how it happens here. Stay and fight! Bye! No, thank you. 10,000 remain. Surely Gideon at this point is like, well, I'm more scared now. Thanks a lot, God. But I said I'd do it. I'm going to do it. God says that's still too many. And so this time, they go get a drink. And most of the people drink, essentially, if we understand correctly, they just kind of get down like this to the edge of the water and drink, kind of like an animal would. But in doing so, I don't know if this is the point at all or not, but in doing so, they're a little less on guard. 300 of them, they cup their hands and drink like this, to where their heads are still up. Again, I don't know if that's the point of this test, but nonetheless, it's those few that drink like this, rather than drinking down here with their heads almost in the water, that actually stay. God says, with these 300 men, I am going to deliver Israel through you. So they prepare. They approach the camp of the Midianites. Meanwhile, the Midianites have heard about the trumpet blowing and the gathering of the army, and so they say, okay, we need to get ready. We need to fight this upstart. We're going to put down this rebellion real quick. They're a professional army, by the way. So they gather. We're told their camp is like locusts. We might not have a good maybe metric for that, but maybe think of when you go out in the tall grass in the summer and there's grasshoppers everywhere, or maybe think about a swarm of ants on an ant bed. That's kind of more what we're talking about. Just so many. Gideon is still afraid. This time, he does not ask God for a sign. This time, God volunteers it. He says, if you still need a sign, if you're still worried, I want you to sneak down with one of your lieutenants, essentially. I want you to sneak down into the camp, and I want you to just listen in to somebody's tent. And that'll give you enough courage to go through with this. Well, Gideon obviously needed that help, because as soon as he hears that, he says, all right, we're going down to the camp. So he sneaks down in the night, and he listens. And outside the tent, this man describes, he says, I dreamed. And there was the whole camp of our army, the Midianites, and all of a sudden this giant loaf of bread comes crashing into the camp and just destroys it. Now, I don't know what kind of nightmares y'all have had, but I don't know that I've ever had a nightmare about killer bread. But that's what he dreams. Remember Gideon's beginning, threshing wheat on the winepress. And the other man in the tent says, this can only be Gideon. The God of Israel is going to give us into his hand. Now, I can't help but wonder what exactly is going on there. Does he even know what he's saying? Are those words put directly into his mouth by God for Gideon's sake? Is this the kind of fear that's been sown into the army, perhaps, through the God's providence? We don't exactly know. But Gideon hears the words. And once again, although Gideon is afraid, he says, all right, there's another sign. So he returns to his men. They have surrounded the camp, as much as you can surround a camp with 300 people, or tens of thousands of men. But they surround the camp. Every single one of them has a torch and a trumpet. And so when Gideon gives the signal, they've been hiding their torches in these clay pots. They all break the pots to where the torches are visible, and they all blow trumpets. Now, if you're familiar at all with how this would usually work, usually you'd have a few trumpeters who are scattered throughout the army. You don't need a whole lot of people blowing trumpets. That's going to be confusing. So you have a few trumpeters that are scattered throughout the army in the sections, if you will, and they will give the signal of when to charge, when to retreat, all those kinds of things. Well, we got 300 men, but every one of them has a trumpet. So it seems like we've got 300 giant groups of men, each one of them needing their own trumpeter. So the torches are shown, the trumpets are blown, and to the Midianites it appears that they are surrounded by a huge force. And in the darkness and in the confusion, remember, they're camped. They're not ready for a fight. They have sentries and guards out, I'm sure, but they're not drawn up in battle order. And they begin in the darkness and the confusion to turn on each other, to kill each other. Gideon doesn't even have to do the work, at least not in the initial engagement. He just sits back and lets them kill each other off. They rout, they begin to flee the camp. That's when Gideon, of course, pursues. All these trumpets and torches following behind them, which they still assume are this giant army. And as they continue running, Gideon calls for others, and others begin to rise up and chase them down on their way out and so forth. And eventually, although we won't go far into this aspect of the story, the kings of Midian are killed, the army is routed, and Israel is delivered. Now, there's a lot we could talk about Gideon. But just for a couple minutes, thinking about Gideon being mentioned toward the end of Hebrews 11, I want us to think about the main character trait that we are shown time and time again for Gideon. What is the main thing that we see in Gideon time and time again? And maybe we could ask it in this way, because it's the same answer. Why did Gideon ask God for so many signs? He asked God first for a sign when he first appears to him. That's when we get the fire burning up the food. Then we have the wool. Then we have the dream with the bread, right? Why does he keep asking God for signs? What is it about Gideon that we're supposed to take away about his character? If you had to boil Gideon's character throughout this story down to one defining word, I'll give you a hint. It's not faith. In the story as told in Judges, what's the one defining characteristic of Gideon? He's afraid. That's how the story is told for us. Time and time and time again, what we see showing in Gideon's character is fear. So he asks for these signs for reassurance because of his fear. I don't know about this, God. I need to be assured that you are actually going to follow through and allow me to do what you're saying you want me to do. Time and time again, starting with something small, tearing down the altar in his hometown, all the way to routing a whole army. And time again, he's asking for confirmation. And he even says, Lord, don't be mad at me. Just let me ask for one more sign. One more sign. Now, this goes a little bit into what we're going to talk about. I believe it's next Sunday morning. But this kind of messes with the definition we sometimes give for faith. Because if you had to compare faith and fear, what are those two things in our minds oftentimes? Do they go together? They're opposites in our minds, right? Usually how we would describe them, faith and fear are two very different things. At least that's the way we usually think of it. And yet Gideon is in Hebrews 11 as an example of faith, when his outstanding quality throughout the account in Judges is fear. Maybe that means that we've got a little bit of redefining to do in our understanding of faith. Now, that's not to say that if Gideon had had more faith, he might not have been as fearful. We could make that argument. That's really an aside to what we're talking about. We could also point out, as we pointed out with Joseph, Gideon has a whole lot less to go on in a lot of ways. I mean, yes, he has miracles happening right in front of him, but he doesn't have all the knowledge, all the history that we have in hindsight. Remember, it has been decades now, by the time Gideon gets around, since you've really had a solid relationship between God and Israel. They've been stuck in this cycle, and a lot has been lost in terms of the knowledge, the closeness, the understanding of who God really is, and the faithfulness to his law. So there's a lot that Gideon is lacking just in terms of advantages in this sense. He's afraid. But that helps us to think about faith. Because every time Gideon is asked to do something, is he afraid? We're told either explicitly or it's implied. Every single time Gideon is asked to do something in the account, he's afraid. Does he ever not do it? He asks for signs. He asks for reassurance, for confirmation. He expresses fear. He expresses doubt at times. But does he ever not do it? No. Oftentimes, kind of like with love, and we talk about this maybe more with love than we do with faith, which is kind of unfortunate because both need to be talked about. Oftentimes with faith, we think of it as this feeling. We think of it as this feeling, this emotion of confidence, this emotion of, oh, everything's fine, I'm not worried. That's not what faith is. Now, does faith sometimes bring about emotions like that? Sure, and that's a blessing when it does. But just like love, faith is not a feeling, it is a choice. It is a choice sometimes in spite of our feelings. Gideon, like many of the people that we have talked about and will talk about in Hebrews 11, Gideon was a flawed individual in many ways. We see a lot of those flaws come out especially later on in his life, which we didn't talk about tonight. But Gideon was a very flawed individual. And you could say one of his flaws was a tendency toward fear. And yet, every time he chooses faith instead of fear. So let's ask this question. He asks for all these signs. Do those signs and the fact that he asks for them make his faith any less valid? Because he expressed fear, said, I'm afraid, Lord, give me a sign, does that mean his faith wasn't valid? Well, he's given as a stellar example of faith in Hebrews 11, so it's kind of hard to make that argument, isn't it? And yet, isn't that what we would naturally assume? I mean, if we compare two people, let's just say David, right? David, as a youth, goes up against a giant without ever asking for a sign. Gideon has the angels of the Lord appear to him in person and ask for 4 signs. I guess 3, and then one of them God gave him without asking. If we compared the faith of the two, I think we would tend to say, well, David's faith was way better than Gideon's faith. And there's a reason why we'd say that. I understand that. But the point, why he's included in Hebrews 11, is that doesn't mean Gideon didn't have faith. Because the faith is found in the choice to act, even though he was still afraid. There is a saying about courage that I've always really admired. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the choice to act in spite of your fear. I would argue faith is the same way, because ultimately faith takes courage, doesn't it? Faith is not the absence of fear, or doubt, or flaws, or mistakes, or questions. Faith is a choice to act despite those things. That's what I would argue we see in Gideon. Flawed, yes. Fearful, yes. But he still made the choice to act in faith. And because he made that choice to have faith, even if he didn't feel like it, which he clearly didn't several times, he nonetheless was able to demonstrate what God could do with a flawed and fearful individual. And not just that. Once again, we talked about the irony. If you're afraid you can go, and 22,000 people leave, Gideon's still there. Eventually it's whittled down to 300. Gideon's still there. By his own standards, I think he probably could have left. But he chose to stay. Just out of curiosity, and we can't know this, but I can't help but wonder, I've got to imagine that some of those 10,000 men and later those 300 men had feelings of fear. Most of them had not been in a battle before. Again, we're not talking about professional soldiers. There are feelings of fear in, unless you're a psychopath, in a normal human being's mind when you're about to go to battle. But they chose to stay nonetheless. Fear can be an obstacle to faith. Fear can be a temptation away from faith. But the choice remains to act in faith even despite our fear. Something that we see as we're going to continue on over the next few weeks, looking at some of these characters in Hebrews 11, something we're going to see is that especially as we get toward the end of the chapter, which is where we find Gideon, we find people that in many ways are increasingly flawed. And yet they are here as examples of faith. Why? I think it's a statement of two things. It's a statement, as we've already said, that faith is a choice. It's also a statement that God can use flawed people who still choose faith, despite their flaws. And that's what we see ultimately with Gideon. Even though he was afraid, he chose to overcome his fear with faith. That didn't remove his fear. If it had removed his fear, he wouldn't have asked for the second and third and fourth signs. It didn't remove his fear. But he chose to overcome that fear with faith anyway. And look what faith made possible. One of my favorite, as a history nerd, one of my favorite battles is the Battle of Cannae. This is in the Second Punic War between Hannibal and the early Roman Empire. I guess it was the Roman Republic at the time. It's a battle where Hannibal is completely outnumbered, outmatched in a whole lot of different ways. Rome has fielded an army bigger than any other army they've ever fielded before, possibly in the neighborhood of 80 to 100,000 men. Hannibal has maybe 50,000, give or take. And at the Battle of Cannae, beyond all odds, Hannibal is able not only to beat, but by his tactics to completely encircle the Roman army, the superiorly numbered Roman army, and all but annihilate the entire army in that battle. It's a masterpiece of military strategy. And yet he still had tens of thousands of men to do that with. Because he chose faith, Gideon routed tens of thousands of men with a few hundred. He made a more impressive dent on military history, if you will, than even geniuses like Hannibal. All because he chose faith. Despite, not in the absence of, despite his fear. That, I would argue, is why Gideon is listed in Hebrews 11. To remind us, we might be afraid at times. We might be seeking reassurance. We might not want to move forward with whatever it is we know God wants us to do. But faith isn't getting rid of all feelings of fear and replacing them with emotions of faith. That's not what faith is. Faith is recognizing I can choose, despite my fear, to do what God wants me to do. I hope this is a lesson that we will remember. We may not face an army that strikes fear in our hearts, but we face things in life that cause fear. We face difficulties in relationships where we know if we do the right thing, that might estrange us from a loved one. We face difficulties in perhaps decisions in our interactions, perhaps in business or other things that put us in a dilemma. Do I do the right thing or do I do what seems to be the smart thing? Whatever it might be. We face situations where fear can prey on us. I mean, just turn on the news if you want an example of fear taking over. Those emotions may not go away, but we can choose to have faith. To have faith in what God has done. To have faith in what God can do through us. His invitation is always open. If there's any way that we can encourage you, please let us know as we stand and sing together.
I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight.